Welcome to EPG Padashala. This module is titled Process of Speciation. In this module, we will first define various speciation modes and what is actually a biological species that we will see in this module. And subsequently, we will see different species concept that is applicable in taxonomy as well as biodiversity. This includes biological species concept and evolutionary species concept, phylogenetic concept and so on. Finally, we will see different modes of the speciation, how a new species is being formed. The origin of species is what you call the speciation events. This includes allopatric speciation, peripatric speciation, parapatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So, first we will define what a species is. Species is the basic unit of taxonomy as well as biodiversity. So, it occupies a central position in understanding the biodiversity of the planet Earth. Often, the species corresponds to what lay people consider as different kinds of organisms. For example, you can think of a cat, a dog, horse, deer, camel, all these people construe that this is like one kind of an organism, so it is like a species. A turtle, a lion, butterfly, a monkey, different kinds of organism, right? But that is not exactly right. As we can see, cat is of course a species, Felis cactus or Felis domesticus, earlier name. Or dog is Canis lupus, of course it's one species. Horse is a species, Equus caballus. Deer is of course it's not a species, it's a family. There are 62 species in the deer. Camel has got 2 species. Turtle is an order, Testudines, and it contains around 250 species. While lion is just one species, Panthera leo. Butterfly is an order, Lepidoptera. It contains around 20,000 species. Monkey, again it's a suborder and it contains around 260 species. So, it's not exactly the kind that the people have in their mind when you hear the word species. So, how you define the species? So, there are several species concepts designed by the biologists to define what exactly is this species. So, again there are a lot of problems with the species concept. So, fixed species concept used to be popular before the theory of evolution by the Charles Darwin. Fixed species concept is that the species is thought to be fixed. It's not a dynamic entity, but it's a static, because earlier days the prevailing theory of how this the life on earth as well as its biodiversity has been originated is through the creation. The God has created everything in one go. According to Abrahamic religion, it's around 6,000 years back. The God has created the whole world. So, it's not really an evolving entity, but it's simple static. So, those kind of concept is called static species concept or fixed species concept. So, one popular definition of species in this particular concept is species are as many as were created in the beginning by the infinite, by the God, as defined by the Linnaeus in his book in 1758. So, species are static entities. Whenever you see the variations, for example, variations in body size or shape or color, these variations that we see in nature are the departure from the ideal essential form. So, each species is considered to have a pure or essential form, and each variants are nothing but a departure from the norm as per the fixed species concept. But Darwin in his Origin of Species by Natural Selection, the classic landmark publication 1859, has transformed the landscape of biology and biodiversity forever. So, species is actually considered to be dynamic, no more static after the Darwinian Revolution. And ever evolving entities, this is no more as fixed varieties, fixed entities at all. So, what constitutes a species has become a profoundly complicated endeavor. So, it would have been much simpler to define what a species is in the light of a special theory of creativity. rather than through the Darwinism. But in the case of Darwinism, each species is evolving. Even we are, the Homo sapiens is evolving. So nothing is static. Every species is somewhere in in the transition from one species to another species. So exactly when does that transition happen is highly complicated endeavor. So Darwin's tree of life and the common descendant is the way to capture this essence in illustration manner. The tree of life says that the origin of life is in the root of the tree, and each time the tree branches splits, that is however the new species are formed, speciation events. Then finally the leaves of the tree is what you call the current extant species in the world, not extinct. So extant living species are represented by the leaves on the giant tree of life. So the tree of life analogy is amazing in one sense, that the whole biodiversity of the planet Earth is interrelated in a tree-like fashion. And every single animal is connected, and everything can be traced back to one common descendant, the common ancestor where we all sprang out from. The common ancestor is called LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, a bacteria that have lived almost 4 billion years ago. So internal nodes in a phylogenetic tree correspond to the speciation events. So there are three most common species concepts which is quite popular in environmental sciences as well as in biology. The first one is evolutionary or phylogenetic species concept, and that is applicable for all organisms. The second one is biological species concept, that is only for the animals, including sexually reproducing plants. And the third one is morphological species concept, which is used quite often in paleontology as well as in microbiology. So first let us see what is an evolutionary or phylogenetic species concept. Here the group of the species is defined as a group of organism that shares an ancestor. So that is actually a clade in a phylogenetic tree. So if the clade can be split from the rest of the tree with just one cut. So one ancestor with all the descendants of a particular tree is what you call species. So a lineage that maintains its integrity with respect to other lineages through both time as well as space is what you call the species. If all individuals of a certain population do not have a common ancestor without the inclusion of the members of other such populations, then that group is no more called the species according to phylogenetic species concept. And this particular evolutionary phylogenetic species concept is direct extension of the Darwin's theory of evolution. And this particular species concept is the most popular concept used across various disciplines in biology as well as in environmental science or biodiversity and so on and so forth. The second concept, biological species concept, which used to be the main concept before the phylogenetic species concept introduced, and is still popular among zoologists. Here the species is defined as a group of interbreeding populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So reproductive isolation is the one defining feature of the species in the biological species concept. So ability to interbreed is a hallmark of the population as per this concept. So if two individuals cannot interbreed, that means even if they can interbreed, they cannot produce a viable offspring, then they do not be part of single species. So they are actually different species. So that is one concept. So if you have individuals of a suspected new species, you can try to interbreed that new species with pre-existing related, the relative of those species. So if they cannot interbreed, so probably this suspected new species is a new species according to the biological species concept. So reproductive isolation is a defining feature of the biological species concept. In the case of morphological species concept, which is quite often used in paleontology as well as in microbiology, the smallest groups that are consistently and persistently distinguishable by ordinary means. So we are not saying about ultrastructural attributes. Ordinary means, maybe with the use of a handheld microscope or or a lens, you can see distinguished features, the morphological features of the varieties. So paleontology often relies only on this morphological species concept because there is no other attributes or traits that we can actually test. Objectively we can verify between 2 or 3 different fossils. So all we have is the morphological attributes, you know. So that's why in the paleontology nothing else can be used. So for example, biological species concept, obviously we cannot test the reproductive compatibility of 2 different fossils, and in the case of phylogenetic species concept, you need to mostly the phylogenetic concept works with the DNA sequence data and or protein sequence data. Of course, you know, if the fossil is a trace fossil and millions of years old, there is nothing, no DNA to be amplified. But of course, there are soft fossils. For example, fossil of mammoth is an exception that do contains the DNA, and the DNA has already been amplified. Species discoveries relies on the species concept. So species discovery, the term is used to refer new species. So if I want to describe a new species, to discover as well as to formally describe a species, I should rely my description on one of the existing species concepts. So species concept, for example, phylogenetic species concept, I can use that. So my biological evidence has to be monophyletic DNA. So in the tree, generated tree, then all new species to form a monophyletic group or a clade. So that is the evidence to substantiate my claim for a new species according to the phylogenetic species concept. So if I want to use biological species concept to substantiate my new finding, then my suspected new species has to be reproductively isolated from all other such groups. Ecological species concept, differential habitat. Morphological species concept, morphological distinct. You know, morphologically the species has to be distinct. And in the case of genotypic cluster concept, different allele frequencies needs to be established if I want to substantiate my claim for a new species. But of course, the species concept, none of the species concept is you know, accepted by all the taxonomies. So there are a lot of problems with the species concept. The you know, the fundamental problem with the species concept is a philosophical debate between realism and nominalism. So as per the realism, abstract objects, for example, the color, you know, the red color or a green color or love or a hate, you know, or nationalism, whatever it is, right, or species, these are abstract entities. So in the case of the realism, abstract objects do exist in the world. But when I ask you, okay, can you show me where is love, what is love? So there is nothing like this is love, this object is love, or this object is species. That is not possible. These are abstract concepts, right? The other group of philosophers, nominalists, they think these abstract concepts are non-existent. These are illusions or a mental construct. For example, love is nothing but it's a mental construct. You know, it's constructed by human mind, the cognitive abilities, and it is actually under the constraint of the language. You know, how I define language depends on which language I use or the way I interpret it. So it is highly subjective. It's not objective. So nominalism and realism is actually you know, the way the species is treated by nominalists and realists are quite contrasting. So J.B.S. Haldane, probably one of the most famous population geneticists and evolutionary biologists, the British evolutionary biologist who was in India for a brief time in Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata, his famous statement is that the concept of a species is a concession to our linguistic abilities and neurological mechanisms, because he was prominently a nominalist. So for him, abstract concepts like species do not exist, only individuals exist in nature. Individuals of species, for example, I am here, right? You are watching this particular module. So only we individuals exist. There is nothing called species according to that one, right? Now there are several other associated problems with a different species concept in empirical problem. The other one is called the philosophical, but here these are empirical, the practical problem. What are the empirical or practical problems with biological species concepts? This is only for the sexually reproducing members. So if two organisms are asexually reproducing, majority of plants all microorganisms are asexually reproducing, and of course herbarium specimen and fossils, there is no chance for testing the mating test, the sexual compatibility, because they are dead specimen. So biological species concept cannot be applicable to a most majority of organisms living on the planet Earth. Then horizontal gene transfer, HGT, is a transfer of genes from one species to other. So it is not the vertical gene transfer. For example, all my genetic constituents, I got it from my parents, right? So that is called the vertical gene transmission. But in the case of horizontal gene transmission, it is actually from, for example, a bacteria to a plant to an animal, or vice versa. So this kind of horizontal gene transfer do exist in the nature. And these HGTs invalidate the assumption that the evolution happens in a tree-like form. Of course, if you if you actually relax your theory, if you include the HGT as one of the prominent mechanisms for the evolution, then the evolution is no more a tree-like. It's like a mesh-like, a net-like, a reticulate form. So the tree of life assumption is partially wrong. Evolution is sometimes reticulate. So species and intraspecific varieties are often a continual spectra. So one specific variety, another variety. So can we call these varieties as a species, or is it actually a one species with multiple varieties? So all these are extremely complicated scenario if you actually look far deeper into a species. So these are actually and one species to another species, if you really look the gradations, so mostly this is a continual spectra. It's like a color, a color from, for example, a blue to green. So if you look at the gradation of the blue changing to the green, it's not like stark contrast, blue and green. No, it is slowly changing to the green. So that way, two species, there is actually no continuous gradation. But you might think like, of course, a cat and a human being, there is a huge gradation, right? All human beings and all cats are very, very dissimilar. But that is extreme. But if you look at very, very two similar, especially a sexually reproducing organism, so the spectra is far more discontinuous. So the problem is quite analogous to the linguistics. So in the case of languages, what is the difference between a language and a dialect? So dialect is actually internal varieties within varieties of one language. Within one language there are a lot of dialects. So when do you call these dialects as a separate language? For example, like Konkani and Marathi. So the difference is extremely very less. Or Urdu and Hindi. So while the scripts are entirely different, Urdu and Hindi are very, very similar language. So the difference is almost like 1%. So why do you call this as two different languages? Aren't these dialects? So the question, is it actually a language or a dialect, is more a political spectra. The language is highly concerned with the politics. So here also the interspecific variance, intraspecific variance. So within species varieties, can you call it as a separate species, is quite technical as well as quite objective. It depends upon the interpretation. Let me read out one of the famous statements from the Charles Darwin in this regard. It all comes, I believe, from trying to define the indefinable. So the Darwin himself is saying the species is indefinable. I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals closely resembling each other. So that is what it's purely arbitrary. It's purely technically you're assigning. You're labeling certain members of the individuals, morphologically similar individuals as a separate species. But it is quite objective. It's not really, it's highly subjective, not objective. So now let us consider different modes of speciation. Speciation means origin of new species. So how a new species is formed. The birth of species, how a new species is born. There are four major modes of the speciation. One is allopatry. Second is parapatry, third is peripatry, and the fourth is sympatry. So first comes to the allopatry. It's the most common form of speciation in which a new species is formed when an original species is divided by a geographical barrier. You need to have this geographical barrier, the process called vicariance. So in vicariance you need to have a barrier that splits the original species into two or more separate species. So, more than two is almost impossible, but of course, there are actually chances, but most often one parental species splits into two daughter species through the vicariance in the mode of allopatry. So, reproductive isolation of population caused by the geographical isolation. So, it is not that first they become reproductive isolate, then the geographical barrier. No, it's not. It's because of the geographical barrier that the two species become discontiguous. It is separated, and then they slowly develop the reproductive isolation. So, after after for example 100 or 1,000 generations, so you need millions of years, then even if these two individuals come back again, they can no longer mate to produce the fertile offspring. So, that is when the reproductive isolation happened. So, initial block to the gene flow in the case of allopatric speciation is a physical barrier that isolate the population. You can think of like a mountain range isolating a previously contiguous population. So, one example here in this particular diagram, you can see that the Isthmus of Panama, before 3 million years there is no isthmus. So, from around 3.5 million years to 3 million years, Isthmus of Panama formed that joined two major landmass on the earth, the North America and the South America. So, isthmus it's actually made these two continents together and connected through the landmass. So, this particular formation of isthmus had huge repercussions on both terrestrial as well as marine animals. So, animals as well as the plants. In the case of terrestrial, formation of isthmus joined the continents, the intermixing of two the fauna from two land masses together. But in the case of ocean, the formation of isthmus became a barrier. So, no longer the for example fish or shrimps from both the sides of this isthmus, that is actually Atlantic or Pacific Ocean, cannot be interbreeded. So, the shrimp population as you can see in this particular diagram, Caribbean Sea of the Atlantic cannot interbreed with that in the Pacific after the formation of isthmus. So, it's been in place for last 3 million years. So, that's one reason, and these shrimps now have diverged into separate species. So, even now if you look at the either Caribbean side or the Pacific side, the nearest relative of Caribbean shrimp is not another Caribbean shrimp, but the nearest relative of Caribbean shrimp is one from the Atlantic, the Pacific. So, Atlantic or the Pacific. So, Atlantic shrimp's nearest relative is a Pacific shrimp. So, Pacific shrimp's close relative is an Atlantic shrimp. So, all these are actually because of the vicariance amount. But again this happened, this particular vicariance were in force for the last 3 million as I told you till 1914. So, what happened in 1914? Human beings, we actually made a shipping canal through the Panama. The Panama Canal opened up in 1914. So, now this Panama Canal allowed the intermixing of these two, partial intermixing, right, whatever is possible through the canal, that actually started intermixing, these two populations, as you can see the Isthmus of Panama. So, the barriers in allopatric speciation may not be just the isthmus, it could be anything, the mountain ranges for example, sea for the terrestrial species, as we can see, the bodies of fresh water, it could be a separating thing, for example a lake, an island inside a lake. So, the bodies of fresh water is surrounding, so it is a barrier. Land for aquatic, especially the freshwater species, for example, you can consider like a lake. So, land, the surrounding land is what it confines that aquatic organism to that particular pond or a lake. Glacial masses, so in between the glaciers that separates two land masses. So, it is not possible for a reptile to cross from one side of a glacier to another side of the glacier. But again, that depends upon which plant. A reptile, it's not possible, but in the case of a bird, it might be possible. It depends upon the range that the birds can fly. Valleys, anthropogenic islands, fragmented forests separated by the cultivation fields. So, that is also a kind of an island, Earlier, it used to be a contiguous forest, then separated by by the human agriculture to different kinds of islands. As you can see in my paper here, this is our one of the recent paper. This paper is called Nucleoplastid DNA Sequence based molecular phylogeny of Salvadora oleoides. One tree of the Salvadora ca in Punjab, India, reveals allopatric speciation, in anthropogenic islands. So that particular tree, that what we did is that we got different species, different members of the same species, that particular one tree all around Punjab, and we sequenced it and we constructed the tree. And as you can see here in this particular tree, there are 3 distinct clades. And each clade has got its own interesting characteristic. We could substantiate these findings using molecular phylogeny as well as the morphology. So this could actually confirm or substantiate our claim that these populations are actually evolving. And what actually happens here is that each of this one is actually a kind of an island. And because of the Punjab, there is a huge agriculture, and this agriculture field separates this patch of forests of this particular tree, the one tree. So this patch can no longer intermix with another patch, because there is actually a huge gap, all the agriculture field. Earlier it used to be just one contiguous species, but now it has been fragmented. So the pollen grains also, it depends upon which tree it is. So will the pollen grains transfer from one island to another island. So all these are different factors contributing to it. Second mode of speciation is peripatry. As the name says, peri, that means peripheral speciation. So in this particular case, which is a subform of allopatry, when isolated peripheral, the fringe group that gets severed from the parent population. So the fringe group gets separated from the parent continuous population, and it forms a separate species. And the rare genes of the fringe population that actually gets into the fixation. So in the parent population, those genes are no longer rare, but because of the separation of the fringe population, this rare becomes fixed. Fixed means the frequency of those alleles become 1. So if these genes are associated with reproduction, the sexual selection takes over, then the speciation has occurred, as they may not be able to mate with the original population. So this is how in the case of peripatry. So one example would be the brown bear. So in the case of brown bear, it used to be a contiguous population. Then some of the fringe members of the brown bear got severed from the rest of the brown bear, and then this fringe population, probably because of the glaciation, they have actually went back to the Arctic side, and it is now it has started evolving to a separate species, and that species is what you call today as the polar bear. Now the polar bear and the brown bear are no longer able to mate with each other to produce the fertile offspring. So peripatric speciation can also be produced by the founder events. So the founder events are where only few members of the individuals of a particular species get introduced, or even one pregnant male, a pregnant female of course, get introduced to a new location, for example an island. So that particular members of the particular introduced species, they evolve quite differently, drastically different from the parent population. So they evolve to a different, altogether new species being formed. So this is what called the founder events. So because which are the members that get selected in the founder events is totally random. So it's a stochastic process. So genetic drift plays a key role in the founder events. So one example is a Hawaiian pitcher wing Drosophila that introduced from one island, the older island, to a new island, and then the third to fourth island. So colonization and recolonization in the Hawaii, that has produced a immense variety of this particular Drosophila species. So if you draw the Drosophila phylogram and the age of islands, so this is actually in perfect, perfectly corroborating with each other. So the harmony is quite drastic. Parapatric speciation. In the case of parapatric speciation, there is no geographical barrier at all. So it often occurs inside the range of the parent population. Ecological niche can differ along an environmental gradient forming something called cline. So, the population is continuous, but nonetheless the population does not mate randomly. So, one example is in the case of this grass variety Anthoxanthum odoratum. So, the grass species that is actually growing in an uncontaminated soil, the healthy soil, and the contaminated, the mine waste soil, they have evolved different flowering time. The phenology has become different. So, the time to flower has become different. So, as you can see in this particular image, the grass variety that is growing in the mine waste is you can see them as flowered. So, they cannot exchange the pollen with that in the uncontaminated soil. So, there is actually no external barrier to the gene flow, there is no geographic barrier, yet they can not mate with each other. There is actually a reproductive isolation happens, but there is no external barrier in this case. Ring species is yet another excellent example of the parapatric speciation. In this case, these are connected by a series of neighboring populations, each of which can interbreed closely sited related populations. For example, in this particular image you can see number 2 that is in Russia that can mate with number 3 and number 1. Number 1 is in Norway. Norwegian population and Russian population, number 2 can interbreed. Or you can consider number 5 that is in that is an Alaskan population can interbreed with the Canadian population, as well as number 4 that is in Russian population. But there is actually an end of these two things. For example, number 1 that is in Norway cannot mate with number 7 that is in Scotland. So, there is an end of this. So, this is actually a very unique problem for the biological species concept too. It is a philosophical conundrum. For example, 1 and 2, these 1 and 7, if you look just 1 and 7, they are reproductively isolated. So, according to biological species concept, these two are indeed separate species, but number 1 is indeed connected through a ring like fashion to number 7. So, how can you call it as two different species? So, it's quite a it's quite a tricky problem for the biological species concept. Another example is Greenish Warbler, a common fly in Eurasia. So, much before like 30,000 years back, so the Greenish Warbler was a continuous population throughout the Eurasia, the Asia as well as Europe. But what happened is that last glacial maxima happened around 20,000 years back. So, during that time most of the Eurasia were glaciated. So, it was extremely cold. Only very few locations that was actually served as refugia. That includes the original glacial refugia were around the Himalayas. So, most of these the warblers went to the Himalaya to seek refuge from the glaciation. And after this from 20,000 onwards years onwards, when the glaciers started retreating back, so then slowly the warblers started spreading in two ways. One on the right side, that is basically towards the east, towards Japan, China and Japan, while not exactly Japan, but the Chinese side, while on towards the west went to all the way to the Eurasia. Now, these two populations of the Greenish Warbler have evolved two different morphological patterns. The Eurasian one has got only one band, while as you can see in the picture, the Chinese one has got two separate bands, and these two things can no longer interbreed with each other. But both of these things can, both of these varieties can breed with the Himalayan population. So, that is actually yet another interesting example for the, for the ring species. Next is Sympatric, which is the least common and is highly controversial. So, new species forms within the range of the original species. So, a mutation might originate one individual and spread to the descendants. After many generations, a significant subsection of the original population might have this particular mutation. So, sometimes this mutation might be related to the reproductive isolation, or it might lead to associative mating, that is a non-random mating. So, members of a species mate with preferred members of that particular species. For example, blue-eyed male meet only with the blue-eyed female, and after thousands of generations, blue-eyed male and female, they might form entirely a new species. So, that kind of way, the associative mating. So, eventually after multiple generations, so sexual incompatibility between the two populations might arise, and virtually separating them into two separate species. So, sympatric speciation occurs when disruptive selection. So, what is a disruptive selection? Is selection of the extreme phenotypes over the intermediate phenotype. So, it is like either too tall or too small, not really intermediate, that kind of selection that results in adaptations to different ecological niche in two populations within the reproductive range. So, here there is no external barrier, these are really within the reproductive age, but because of the disruptive selection, members are either for one particular trait either selected for extreme values of the Gaussian curve, either too left or too right, not right in the middle. One example here is a Lake Apoyo in Nicaragua. So, after a cyclid fish got introduced, so they have evolved, the pelagic one, the surface layers, and the benthic one. Because of the different resource utilization, the benthic fish started copulating only with the benthic fish, while the pelagic one copulate only with the pelagic one. So, after multiple generations, so they have evolved to two different separate species. The Midas cyclid, that is actually a stout and large one that is adapted to crushing with the jaw, that is actually benthic one, while the Aerocyclid, that is actually feeding on zooplankton, which is more slender, more smaller one, that is adapted to the pelagic one. So, now no longer these two pelagic and benthic can no longer copulate. So, they have turned into two separate species. So, sympatric speciation most commonly occurs through polyploidy. So, it is basically random mutations that that the complete set of genome is actually multiplications of the complete set of genome happens. So, in which an offspring of a group of offspring will be produced with multiple sets of the normal number of the chromosomes. So, tetraploid, for example, instead of simple two sets of a diploid member, so it is become four sets, complete duplication of the genome happens. So, if had it been an animal, if it is a tetraploid animal, to reproduce it, so the animal needs to find its sexual partner, that too has to be tetraploid. So, it is extremely rare in the case of animals, but tetraploid plants can self-fertilize. The plants have the ability, most of the plants have the ability to selfing or self-fertilization. So, this kind of polyploidy is very common mechanism for the plants. So, a number of plant variety, for example, bread wheat or an apple. So many kinds of plant varieties are polyploid, and this kind of a new species formation through polyploidy occur most often in the case of animals. Coming to the rate of speciation, evolutionary forces that decrease the variation within the population while increase the variation between two populations, these do favor the speciation. So, for the speciation to happen within population, variation should be very less. Within population, variation should be very less for the second population as well, but between 1 and 2 populations, the variation has to be very, very large. So, in the case of mutation, what it does is that it simply increases the variation, right? The mutation is totally random, and mutation simply increases the variation either within the population or between two populations. So, the effect is mixed for the speciation. In the case of migration, what happens? There are two kinds of migration, either immigration or emigration, right? In the case of immigration, members of other population is actually immigrating, coming into India. For example, Brazilian population is coming to India. So, in this case, Indian population, the variation will increase, right? So, intra-population within population variation will increase, which is not good for the speciation to happen. While in the case of emigration, Indians going to the Brazil, so effect is not really apparent. Few members of Indian going to Brazil, even half of Indians migrating to Brazil does not have huge repercussions in Indian population. No. So, that is not a big factor. So, altogether the migration effect is negative because of the immigration. So, for the speciation, the migration is not a good a mechanism at all. So, in the case of genetic drift, it increases the variation between the population while it decreases the variation within the population. So, both of these are good news for the speciation to happen. So, the genetic drift, the effect is positive. So, in summary, since the advent of the Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, fixed species concept, earlier popular with the Carl Linnaeus and others, have largely gone out of favor. Three most important modes of speciation are, the concepts of speciation are evolutionary or phylogenetic species concept, biological species concept, morphological species concept, and amongst which evolutionary or phylogenetic concept is the most prominently used and universally followed. So, as species is an abstract concept, proponents of the nominalistic philosophy believes that the species is an artifact, a mental construct, and only individuals exist in the nature, no abstract concept like the species. So, the main problem with the biological species concept is that it is based on the sexual compatibility. So, those organisms that are asexually reproducing or parthenogenetically reproducing, you cannot test the validity of the species concept using the biological species concept. A precise boundary between species and intraspecific varieties is hard to define, as the species are dynamic entities, evolving entities, and they are continuously being evolved. So, species are formed through the process of speciation by four major modes. So, out of which allopatry is or the vicariance is the main mode, the major mode is allopatry. Peripatry can be regarded as a subtype of allopatry when peripheral population gets severed from the main population and evolve to a new species. Speciation through the founder events are a special case of peripatry. In the case of parapatry, niches differ along an environmental gradient, hampering the gene flow and thus creating a cline. This would lead to associative mating and ultimately speciation. A special case of parapatry is ring species. In sympatry, disruptive selection results in adaptations to different ecological niche in two populations within the reproductive distance. This mode occurs commonly in plants via polyploidy. Evolutionary forces that increase within population variation and the decrease within population variation and increase between population variation tend to favor speciation, while vice versa as well. So, in summary, species is hard to define. So, species, there are multiple ways to define what constitutes of species, out of which biological species concept used to be the most prominent, but of late it has largely gone out of favor. Right now, the most prominently used to define a species is evolutionary species concept or phylogenetic species concept, which is defined based upon synapomorphic character, those character that is shared between the one descendant, one common ancestor and all the descendants. A new species is formed through speciation, and out of which there are four modes of speciation happens, and the most prominent mode is allopatric speciation that happens through vicariance. So, vicariance is when geographical barriers separate the parent population into two or more daughter populations. Further to the allopatric speciation, there are peripatric speciation where the peripheral population gets separated from the rest of the population, where the founder event is one of the example. Parapatric speciation that happens within the range through separated by a cline. Environmental niche is the major factor that is determining the parapatric speciation. Ring species is an example of the parapatric speciation. And finally, sympatric speciation that happens within the parent range, and especially with respect to in response to disruptive selection, especially for different resource utilization. Thank you for listening. Thank you.